Thank you everyone who is on this meeting for joining us today. This is the first in our new workshop series focused on business related issues. And so welcome. My name is Stan Odenthal. I am the Director of Business Relations for Heartland Workforce Solutions. We are a nonprofit here in the Omaha area that focuses on workforce development. We serve Washington, Douglas, and Sarpy counties, and receive a lot of the federal funds related to workforce development to help implement programs for businesses as well as for job seekers. And so feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions related to either this presentation or to the services that we provide. As you notice on your screen, you can see some of that contact information. You can also see a link to upcoming events. I'll put that in the chat as well for business workshops that will be upcoming. We've got a great slate of different workshops. They will be held the third Thursday of each month. And so, as I mentioned, this is the first one, and we're going to be getting this kicked off today. We've got a great conversation for you. Today's topic is hiring and retaining individuals with disabilities. After the presentation, we will be making a recording of this presentation available for anyone that's interested to share with their colleagues or anything else. That will be on the webpage that is listed here that I put into the chat. But without further ado, let me introduce you to our speaker for today. Rich McFall is a business account manager for Nebraska VR. He also helps lead the Employee OMA initiative, which is a collaborative of workforce development partners across the Omaha metro area that kind of work together to help create solutions for businesses as well as job seekers. And so I will hand this topic over to Rich and let him get started on today's presentation. And again, thank you for joining us today. And Rich, it's all yours.
All right, well, thanks, Stan. Good to see some familiar faces and then some new ones there. So as you said, my conversation is going to be about hiring and retaining individuals with a disability. I'm the business account manager for the Omaha area. And just if you didn't know, VR is a short term for vocational rehabilitation, and it's a completely free service that exists in all of the 50 states. So here's the framework for today, just some of the topics that I'm going to go over, including disability etiquette, some reasonable accommodations, some facts, misconceptions, those kind of things. Before we get started, I would like to poll the audience. What percentage of the adult population in the US is considered to have a disability? And I'm curious what your thoughts are. And Stan, I can't see that if it's.
I think it might be because you're sharing your screen, but I think others are able to vote on it. I'm starting to get some voting numbers. So I'll end the polling and share the results, and hopefully you're able to see it. Are you able to see that, Rich?
I can't, so you'd have to just tell me.
Yeah, I'll just tell you. So the options here were 12.4%, 18.7, 25.6, or 34.3. So we had 2 people say 12.4, 2 people say 18.7, 1 person say 25.6, and 3 people say 34.3. So who was right, Rich? What's the correct answer?
25.6. So I do know that my counterpart on here from Lincoln is on there, so I really hope that she knows that answer. But this is definitely a great conversation to kind of get things started. So going forward, we've got the disability definition. So ultimately, it's a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. A person who has a history or a record of such impairment, or a person who is perceived by others of having such impairment. So for one, they're all listed right there, which are all very important, but I would like to point out the and working part of that. So to kind of go from what we did on the poll, so ultimately 1 in 4 adults in the United States have some sort of disability. Actually here in Nebraska, we're at 22.2. So still pretty common, at least as far as, close to the 1 in 4 adults. Sometimes they say that you may have heard them be called as individual or invisible or hidden disabilities. Some of those could be like autism, diabetes, chronic pain, depression, ADHD, or dyslexia. And also with the 26% of those adults, 70% of those are considered to be invisible. So just to kind of throw it out there, you may not always know that it exists, but just kind of being aware that it's definitely always a possibility. Let's see. So ultimately with with being an inclusive workplace, making your workplace diverse, so employees feel valued, welcomed, ultimately instead of isolated. So one thing I really like to pinpoint on this is, embracing somebody's different backgrounds or perceptives. Some companies can do something fun and exciting where maybe somebody's from a different part of, the United States or maybe the world, and just kind of embracing their culture, their heritage, and maybe having, a food event or something related to that, all of which those are kind of things related towards an inclusive workplace. So we ask, why is inclusion important? Ultimately, in my opinion, quality of life, really just being self-sufficient and having a sense of purpose, having a unique set of skills, abilities, and talents. The other thing too is generally people do not require help to work. They need barriers removed, which with some of my HR experience, that is probably my favorite part of just realizing what barriers exist and how do we remove those. So going on to the next one here, we've got misconceptions. So some people think that someone with a disability cannot perform the essential functions of a job. Sometimes they think that providing reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities is expensive. And of course, hiring people with disabilities may scare some customers away, all of which not true. So kind of going with that, there's some data related to that. And I don't want to go too crazy in some data, but at least with the performance-based, DuPont did a study of 2,800 employees, ultimately found out that 92% of the employees with disability had average or better job performance compared to the 90% of employees without disabilities. And as far as like the accommodation, 73% of the employers that their employees who had disabilities did not require special accommodations. Overall, when accommodations are made, they're led to the innovation in the workplace and that are benefiting the workers, including those that are aging. So the other part too that I really like to point out, so out of the 50% of those that do need some kind of accommodation, they're less than $600. And out of that 56%, 81% of them are less than $100 or maybe even free. So one of the big topics, not only for this presentation, but for everything nowadays, is really just doing person first language. So why do we want to put the person first? I know at least when I first realized that, it was with the ADA, and when they talk about, Americans with disabilities, just putting that American term first before the actual disability, just kind of ultimately realizing that they're a person before naming their disability. One of my things is to not use outdated terms like handicapped. I will say that I've done some research on that, and there's two different definitions based upon how that word originated. One, which means cap in hand, which ultimately means that somebody wearing like a baseball cap or a top hat has their hand grabbing it and putting their hand out, ultimately asking for money. Another definition actually uses it in the realm of like horse races. And when they were betting and those kind of things, that they would actually put ropes with rocks on the end to weigh down a horse, ultimately trying to make it slower. And that's another way of where the handicap kind of came into play. And I guess the big thing in here to kind of take away is if you don't know, just ask. You know, a lot of people who have a disability are okay to talk to it as long as your intentions are good. So, you know, just kind of think about that when you do have somebody that you're worried about talking to. My next topic is going to be discussing disability in interviews and inclusive hiring practices. We're just going to go into kind of some what you can ask, what you can't ask, you know, that kind of thing. So this one looks a little complicated, but really it kind of breaks down like the application process. And when it says you may ask, can you perform these functions with or without reasonable accommodations? That's ultimately altogether yes or no. So that's saying that, you know, either you do or you don't, either way, can you do the job? Yes or no. Now that's okay. Now on the flip side, if you ask if they can do it without reasonable accommodation, they want to know, can you do it without? Which for one, that's not part of the question, because ultimately they want to know, can you perform the essential functions of the job? The other thing that I want to point out too is when you can't say certain things related to like workers' compensation history, that for one isn't relevant to the job. And that's just kind of what you need to focus on, is that if it's not relative to the job itself, then it's probably not appropriate to ask. So a little bit more about disability disclosure. You know, some companies which are referred to like the 503 or section 503, where they're asking for self-identification on a topic. That's where they have these check boxes saying, yes, I have a disability, no, I don't have a disability, or I don't want to disclose it. And definitely, as Stan put into the chat, I want to just point out that if you do have any questions or anything during any of the conversation, definitely put those in there, where I would much prefer to just answer questions and those kind of things versus necessarily going through like a presentation. One cool thing that I found, it's called a Marshmallow challenge. So ultimately what it is they give the individual 18 minutes, 20 feet of, or 20 sticks of spaghetti noodles, 1 yard of tape, 1 yard of string, and 1 marshmallow. Ultimately where this comes from is the company Microsoft. They use this in their hiring practices when they're looking for, or when they realize that they're ultimately trying to hire somebody with autism. So what they do is kind of in a group setting and having them build a structure and to find out exactly like how do they work well in a team, those kind of things. And just to ultimately just realize that sometimes interviews can be a very stressful process. All right. I'm assuming that was you, Stan, that you're pretty amazing at the Marshmallow challenge. Is that right?
I am. Yes, I've done that so many times. I love doing that with groups of people, and it's crazy, like the different types of structures you see built by people, and yeah, it's I've learned some of the secrets along the way, and so it's fun. I've done it with my kids too. It's cool.
Say not to go off topic, but I totally thought you meant the Chubby Bunny challenge, seeing how many of those you can put in your mouth and still say Chubby Bunny. But I'm glad to see you're actually using the constructive side of it.
No, I think I'd be good at either one, honestly.
Thank you. So at least with this one, creating an inclusive work environment, same thing I want to point out here with celebrate employee differences. It's okay to be the same. In fact, I prefer it that way, just so we're not all the same. You know, just because if we were just, you know, copy and pasted multiple times, I find that to be a little boring. So definitely being able to take somebody's strength or weakness and kind of use it either to, someone's advantage, or, at least in my group, and, realizing who excels better at writing documents versus PowerPoints, and just kind of working together and finding out what each other's strengths are. The next one, I got a video here. This one's going to be on behalf of Apple. So I do have my sound sharing, so we'll see if that works here. Oh, sorry.
Open. Open a door, and it opens all the others. Open a mind, and see what happens next. No great thing, no beautiful invention was created in a vacuum. It happens when we leave our comfort zone and come together. Embrace faiths, cultures, disabilities, differences. Embrace races, ages, ideologies, personalities, creating a tool or device nobody saw coming. Humanity is plural, not singular. The best way the world works is everybody in, nobody out. So who we're made of is everyone. Differences not just celebrated, but essential. Many more women in charge. Equal pay for equal work everywhere. A new generation of Apple, more diverse than the one that came before. Open is not just who we are, but what we believe as a company. Because humanity isn't singular, it's plural. The truth is, we don't see things the same. The power is, we don't see things the same.
All right. Does anybody have any questions or comments or anything? I would just like to say one of my favorite things in there is where it says the truth is we don't see things the same. The power is that we don't see things the same. Just kind of makes us all feel a little bit more equal. Next slide here. So reasonable accommodations. So to kind of explain some of this, ultimately it's going to come down to that whole part of, can you perform the essential functions of the job? And sometimes it's a yes, but sometimes that also might be a no, and just trying to figure out how exactly you're going to accomplish that. So one thing I like to do is to kind of brainstorm a little bit and think about a few things. So what if the standard door height wasn't the same and you had a duck every time that you entered into your home? Now imagine that you have groceries or something in your hands. Think about the standard height of a kitchen sink. Weirdly enough, the common height is actually 36 inches. Because if you just kind of think about it, when you go into one person's house, typically their countertops at the same height, which is great for consistency. But imagine if you maybe have like a visual impairment or something, it just makes things a little bit easier to kind of, be mobile. And I also want to point out, like with your driver's seat in your car, what if it was always in a fixed position? I don't know if you guys have ever gotten into a car after someone else has driven it, whether if you hit your head or you just get in there, maybe you don't fit right, all of those kind of things. Just thinking if that was in a fixed location, this is kind of going into what I'm trying to accomplish with the inclusivity part of it, that you're not necessarily trying to do it for one particular person. You're trying to be inclusive and doing it all for everyone, because things like this benefit everybody, not just one particular group or definition. All right, so now I'm going to go through all 5 of the Americans with Disability Act, or ADA. Just kidding. I'm actually just going to go through with the first one, which is Title I, all geared towards employment. That was for you, Stan. So at least as far as the Title I, so employment meets the definition to be qualified. Can you perform the essential functions of the job with or without reasonable accommodations? And ultimately, can they do the job? Employers who are, so purchases outside of the workplace. So employees are not required to purchase anything needed outside of the workplace, meaning like eyeglasses, maybe wheelchairs or hearing aids, say those kind of things where it's typically going to be something needed for the job.
So Rich, can I jump in on that slide a little bit?
Yeah.
Could you talk more about maybe like how the essential functions of the job are determined? I mean, where does that come from?
Great question. So typically those are seen on a job description. So one thing that I commonly use is kind of back in my retail days, when you think of like a cashiering job, you know, their essential function of the job is the cash register. Now, sometimes you have other duties as assigned, which is a common word in there, that'll talk about, you know, maybe you've got to do a dust mop or put away returns, or, you know, refill the bags, or, you know, whatever it may be. Some of those tasks can be, you know, moving things around, so heavy lifting. They could be walking around a lot. So those kind of things are the part of a job that maybe not as essential as you think. Ultimately, at the end of the day, in the retail world, the most important person is the one that's handing you their money. So you kind of look back at the whole cashiering side. So does that answer your question, Stan?
Yeah, I think that's just something that a lot of people get hung up on is like, well, you know, it listed out all of these required qualifications and preferred qualifications and all of these random things, but what really are the essential qualifications? So I think that definitely helped to answer that question.
Say thank you. And the easiest way, and especially when you think of like, you know, cashiering or whatnot, you know, sometimes you get questions why somebody might have a stool and someone else, but it ultimately doesn't matter. You don't have to explain those things. It's just one of those that typically there's a doctor's note involved, and that's really all that matters. So going on to this slide, reasonable accommodations. So like I was saying, that's kind of what I was getting at, but the definition. And for one, when it comes to disclosure, you have to be okay talking about it. If you keep it to yourself, you can't expect anybody to possibly offer any kind of assistance or anything. And ultimately, it does need to be effective for the purpose. The other side too is that the employer must provide some kind of reasonable accommodation to individuals with disabilities in the workplace, unless it was going to pose an undue hardship. So let's say Stan here, you know, just really likes to have it extra cold in his office. You know, paying for an extra AC unit in there doesn't really make sense, where everybody else has to benefit from it as well. It's just not necessarily one person's benefit. The other thing that I want to point out is an amazing tool, and it's the askjan.org. Stands for the Job Accommodation Network. They have a lot of great resources, training material, and a lot of good things to look at.
So one more question here. On this one, when it comes to reasonable accommodation, you talked about the undue hardship. So as a business, you know, when I'm engaging in that conversation with the individual, how do you document that conversation, what that looks like, and then ultimately, if it does become something that is an undue hardship, what from the business side of things do they need to do in order to kind of document that process?
Yeah, another great question. So I think about one of my legal managers back in the day, And he made the comment that you can't approve a reasonable accommodation or leave of absence or any of those that ultimately last forever. So whenever there's a reasonable accommodation, you want some kind of ending date, or at least a date of, maybe I have a doctor's appointment or whatever in 6 months. Have the note be on that day, and maybe they need it for an additional amount of time, but that's mainly what the provider is going to determine, and then they can have another one. So just because an accommodation has an end date doesn't mean that it can't be reestablished. And also too, it's kind of one of those things where if you think about, if you did it for one employee, you have to do it for the other. So at least in my mind, what I try to do is kind of flip the person in my mind and think of, like necessarily like if Vicky's asking for a reasonable accommodation, and maybe I consider it to be undue hardship, but then if Stan was to ask, would I make the same decision that I would for Vicky? And when it comes to the HR world, your answer should always be yes, just because it's not about the person, it's about the situation, about, how much is it going to cost and kind of those things. At least for my retail world, we had chairs accessible in the store that we actually sold. So it didn't really cost us anything to go grab one from the back and have it, if somebody needed to sit down, 5 minutes for every hour that they worked or something like that. Does that answer your question, Stan?
Yeah, I think so. And it seems like from my point of view, one of the biggest keys there is just that engagement of kind of the conversation between the employer and the employee, of understanding the need and making sure that you can fully understand the need before you make a decision as to what that accommodation really looks like, or whether it would create an undue hardship for the business. It's just engaging the employee.
Absolutely. And I want to kind of hit on the disclosure part. So ultimately, it's necessary to receive the disclosure when the disability or a need for the accommodation is not known or obvious. So sometimes you may not know exactly what the accommodation could be, but at the same time, you may not know what it is, or you may not, you can't just, I'm assuming, ultimately you're trying to get some kind of facts. But yes, I'm going to refer definitely back to the askjan.org, just because there is a lot on there. And always going to say this too, but if you have any questions, that's kind of where somebody from the legal staff can definitely kind of help you look at some of those terminologies and try to find out how they can accomplish things. So a little bit more on the reasonable accommodation. So modifying written materials, meeting locations, like prime example, let's say it's up a flight of stairs, may not be accessible to everybody. Now, if there's an elevator, great, it's still accessible. So, but not every company has the privilege to have an elevator. So it has to be acceptable. You can also look at modifying work schedules. That could be, stamina, like maybe they can only work 3-4 hours, maybe it's 7, 8, versus like, I don't know, somebody wants to do like a 12-hour shift. Like sometimes they just don't make sense. So providing or modifying equipment or devices, that could be as simple as like a keyboard. It could also be like a desk riser. It could be a standing desk, special mats. I mean, that's ultimately going to be what is going to benefit everybody. Sometimes it's kind of where it's easier, where if you think of cashiers nowadays, a lot of them will have a mat to stand on. That's the inclusive part, that it benefits every cashier, not necessarily just those that ask for one or have documentation. Sometimes reasonable accommodations can be cheap, or super simple. I know one employee that comes to mind that, I knew that he had some kind of disability, but it's not like I needed to ask for a doctor's note for me to print out his pay stub for him. It's kind of one of those where, just common sense sometimes on trying to realize what is needed to better an employee. Ultimately, we all want to know what we're going to get paid and those kind of things. So any questions on that one? Okay. So a couple things not considered accommodation. So those conduct standards, like you can't be late, you can't necessarily just show up when you want to. Everybody is going to have the same kind of attendance policy, those kind of things. Performance standards, those two, you either need to, you ultimately have to perform the same way, but that's also kind of where you look at some of the job descriptions and have things kind of make sense. Let's see, so at least I guess with this one, eliminating essential job functions, that kind of goes back to what I was saying before. Like a cashier, you can't just have them not cashier. It's like you might want to look into a different position or some of those things. And one of my favorite ones is definitely you can't just change your supervisor because you want a reasonable accommodation. Like your supervisor is there for a reason because the company has deemed them appropriate, those kind of things. And sorry, guys. So touch on this one again. So when can a reasonable accommodation be denied? Again, it's just going to be based upon that undue hardship. So if it's going to be unduly costly or administrative burdensome, interferes with somebody's rights or safety, and ultimately fundamentally changes the way that business is conducted. So is there something as far as over accommodation? And of course, leniency on dress code is one, letting somebody show up in their pajamas when you're seen with the public, those kind of things. It's not necessarily going to be appropriate for the image of the company. Free foods, excessive food rewards, those kind of things. Excessive breaks really just kind of decreases the productivity. Just when you think about every time that you take a break, you kind of have to get back and reprocess a little bit and then start up. Sometimes, that's going to be, like I said, kind of before, maybe 5 minutes of sitting down for every hour, those kind of things where it can't be, sitting down half of the amount of time or something. That's kind of where it would go back to the doctor and make sense if there actually should be working, based upon current restrictions or whatnot. So lack of critical or specific feedback, kind of goes back to the performance standards. Ultimately, everybody is going to have the same expectations and performance guidelines. Accountability and rules, back what I said with like being late, coming in when you want, just because you don't like to get up early. Maybe you need to look at doing some of the later shifts, evening shifts. Could be as simple as medication, like time that you take it, where you kind of have to, still find out what's the root cause of it and kind of how to overcome that. So here, this is one of the awesome things, and if I'm not mistaken, they'll talk a little bit more about some other grants and opportunities later in the business workshop. But this one here is the Work Opportunity Tax Credit, which commonly known as WOTC. Really just gets it. It's a federal income tax incentive provided by private sector employers to hire a group of a certain targeted group of job seekers who face employment barriers. So they can get up to a one-time tax credit up to $2,400 for each new hire. And there's no limit on the number of new hires that you can have that would qualify for that. Obviously, the same person just can't get the same one twice. The one I like to mention is the barrier removal tax credit. You kind of think of like a parking lot and maybe it's an employee parking or those kind of things. Maybe a curb is the issue there. And, maybe you've got like a ramp or something, and having that curb actually cut out is removing a barrier. And there are certain kind of tax deductions and stuff that you can get, at least as far as looking into those things, because again, kind of goes back to the inclusivity and being able to, let people get out of their car so they can actually show up for work. I know sometimes with the ADA and those kind of things can get a little heavy. I will just point out that the Department of Justice does provide technical assistance to businesses, both state and local governments, and the individuals with their rights or responsibility under the law. You can actually call this number there and just ask them questions. They have a ton of specialists that really understand how the ADA works in their situation. They're typically there Monday through Friday. So definitely if you have any kind of question or concern or anything like that, I would say to reach out to them. And kind of when I was going back to like some technology stuff, one of the companies that we work with is called the Assistive Technology Partnership. And really what they do is that they kind of look into, like I said before with that keyboard, maybe it's a one-handed keyboard or, that desk riser or any of those kind of things. That's mainly what they're going to look at. So they can do a worksite evaluation. They can look at some designs, some adaptations, and some technical training. Really looking into like the worksite modifications. And probably my favorite thing when it comes to businesses is the trial use of equipment. So one of their programs is actually a loan program, and that website will be on my next slide. But when we go to like that one-handed keyboard that I keep referencing, there's a lot of different options out there when it comes to assistive technology, and a lot of them are pretty expensive. So I know at least they let you loan or, you borrow it for 90 days. You do have an option to buy it. Sometimes things are just free. A lot of them are going to be reused. But what I'm getting at is that you can try out a particular keyboard for your employee and see kind of if it works. Maybe there's an alternative, kind of try it before you buy it kind of thing, because like I said, those things are not typically cheap. So at least just trying to be able to see if that works. Maybe there's a newer version of what they like or whatnot, but it ultimately helps you buy the right one the first time and not have to worry about some of those buying more than what you need.
Rich, can I give you a break for just 1 second, just to see if we can get some engagement from the folks on the call? Has anyone had any experience with assistive technology of purchasing that for folks that they work with, or even the accommodation side of things? And as you're thinking about that, I'm going to launch another polling question just to kind of see who we have in the audience here. Let me do that real quick. So this one is asking, what economic sector is your company most connected to? So if you wouldn't mind taking a break, taking a look there and giving us your results, voting in that survey. And then as you think about that question too, of what Rich is talking about, any examples or any questions related to accommodations or past experience providing accommodation or that assistive technology. So I'll give you another few seconds to answer the poll question. And I'm going to end the polling question. So we've got a few folks from manufacturing as well as education, and then quite a few from a lot of workforce development partners. So I'll take that down, that polling question. Any commentary on the assistive technology side of things or providing accommodation? Any success stories in the past?
For me or somebody in the audience?
For anyone in the audience.
Yeah.
Hi, this is Tabitha with the Nebraska Department of Labor. And I just know when I was working out at HWS in the resource room, we had a few individuals that would come in who were visually impaired. And out there they have a computer set up for them to use. And I guess I was surprised. We had training on how to use it, but most of the time the individuals who come in, they would already know how to use it. So we just, show it to them, and then they would get on the computer and know how to work it. So I guess it was really good having that in the center because they were able to use it and our services to help them. So.
I definitely appreciate that, Tabitha. That's a good experience there as well. I'm going to launch one more polling question before we get back to Rich's presentation. This one's asking, what was your level of familiarity with this topic coming into this workshop? And I'll tell you a little bit about kind of my past experience with this subject matter as we're getting these polling results back. So I had the opportunity to work with the Nebraska Equal Opportunity Commission there for a while and be involved in a lot of the investigations related to issues with disability. And so with that, I mean, so much of the accommodation side of things and making a determination of whether there was cause in a case, so much of that was dependent on that conversation and what that conversation looked like between the employer and the employee, and how much that employer really engaged the employee in that conversation. And so when there was cause that was found in issues of discrimination based off of disability, it was typically when an employer didn't engage the employee at all on any level and basically said, nope, we can't do that, without even finding out anymore. And so that's why it is so important to make sure that you are in compliance with the law, that you are engaging those employees when a request is made. Yeah, so let me end this polling question here. And it looks like I'll share the results. We had a few people answer. And so, yeah, most people were kind of in the middle, answering a 2 or a 3 of either slightly familiar or moderately familiar. And we have one person who is extremely familiar. So that's always good too. But I'll give it back to you, Rich. Go ahead. No, I think you're on mute.
All right, say that always helps. But thank you for that. But one company that specifically comes to mind is here in Omaha. And I just want to point out that there's so many different ways to be inclusive, where this particular company actually has different textures on the floor to help those that are visually impaired or blind to know which area is going to be a restroom versus which one is going to be an office door. They also do different textures on many different things. And then they also do a lot of plexiglass on those, like, no touch areas, which they were doing all of this beforehand, and having all of those plexiglass barriers and whatnot not only helps protect the safety aspect, but it's also helping, with the coronavirus and those kind of things. So, being inclusive in the first place really kind of helps you be where you don't necessarily have to panic if something was to happen and that kind of thing. And at least as far as what he was getting at, there is some home modifications that can be made, vehicle ones, of course, the basic like hearing aids and some of the vision devices, but those are just kind of to name a few. This is what I was getting at with the AT for all. That is the website where you yourself can post things on there, where maybe you've got an extra keyboard or maybe a ramp or a chair or something that maybe you want to get rid of. You can either put it on there and have it be free. You can drop it off at our downtown location. You can also put it on there for a cost. It just kind of depends on what it is. So if you go to the atforall.com, you can see all of the different types of accessibility options in there. Say last video here. Before I do that, does anybody have any questions, comments, or anything?
So Rhonda asked if we would be able to get a copy of the presentation.
Yeah, so actually here, right after the video, I'm going to have a QR code that is going to have my email attached to it. So you can either scan it or you can just send me an email, and I'll definitely send out some resources and information on that.
Perfect, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. All right. Any more questions?
Paige mentioned that the links you've shared have been very helpful, so thank you.
Awesome. Stan, and here after the video, you'll see with the resources that'll have a PDF that'll get you a little bit more one-to-one hyperlinks and whatnot. So I'll go ahead and start the video here. this I just recently came across and I really enjoy it. So I'm really sorry if it gets stuck in your head because it's a little catchy. Just gonna say, Vicky, this is for your brain.
The baker had Simone, and everybody saw that she could do the job. The lawyer went to the baker and saw Simone at work. The lawyer hired John because the baker had Simone. The baker had Simone. The dentist went to the lawyer and saw John at work. The dentist had Sophia because the lawyer had John, because the baker had Simone. The baker had Simone. The farmer went to the dentist and saw Sophia at work. The farmer had Kate because the dentist had Sophia, because the lawyer had John, because the baker had Simone. The baker had Simone. The barber went to the farmer and saw Kate at work. The barber had Paul because the farmer had Kate, because the dentist had Sophia, because the lawyer had John, because the baker had Simone. The baker had Simone. The baker went to the barber and saw Paul at work. He didn't have a clue, but it was thanks to his first move that the barber had Paul, because the farmer had Kate, because the dentist had Sophia, because the lawyer had John, because the baker had Simone. The baker had Simone. The baker had Simone. Yeah, yeah.
Perfect. How was it? You like it?
I'm going to be singing that song on the way home. I guarantee it. Yeah.
I've had it stuck in my head for the last few days. So, but no, I've even watched it probably like 6 times. You know, Stan, that video is actually why I didn't want to send you the PowerPoint, because I didn't want you to sneak a peek or get curious or any of those things. But ultimately, it kind of goes back to what I said with the inclusivity part. So kind of as I mentioned before, if you're tech savvy, know how QR codes work, you really just take your smartphone and just turn on your camera, point it at that QR code. It'll automatically generate an email for you directly to me. You don't have to write anything down. I kind of encourage you just to try it out and see what you come up with. But if not, definitely can just send me an email at rich.mcfall@nebraska.gov. Any questions or anything? I'm not seeing the chat feature right now. Is there anything in there, Stan?
Alejandra said we should put that video and some of this info on our HWS website. So we're planning on doing that. We're going to do for all of these business workshops, we're recording them and we will put them out on our website. But I think we probably do need to link to that video directly as well, and maybe do a little karaoke session for all of us, because that song is a good song. So, and I really like your snazzy QR code thing here. It worked out pretty well. I just sent you an email telling you good job on the presentation. So hopefully you get some other emails from folks, you know, with some additional follow-up or some questions. So
yeah, awesome. Say thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I will say, so what Stan has is going to be really a list of all of these resources from many different areas. I did reference the Ask Jan on there. Of course, our website is going to be super helpful. We have a lot of, in a nice way, we have a lot of counselors and some heavy information within our agency, but the website is actually going to be the most simplified and easy for you and I to understand. So lastly here, I'll let you take it over, Stan, but I just want to thank everybody for being here and hearing me talk about the inclusivity part, and definitely hope that song sticks in your head a little bit. And just want to say thanks again.
Yeah, and we want to say thank you to Rich today for volunteering to be our first in this new Better Business workshop series that we're doing. And so thank you for your presentation and all of the effort that you put into doing that. And we've got some additional great topics coming up. If you look at this slide, it shows you that next month's presentation is going to be on Thursday, May 20th. It's going to be focused on employment discrimination, overview and updates. And we will have folks from the Omaha Human Rights and Relations, as well as the Nebraska Equal Opportunity Commission and the Lincoln Commission on Human Rights as the presenters for that topic. And so you'll also notice that in the chat box, as well as on this slide, is a link to our webpage related to this new Better Business Workshop series. We've got a lot of great topics coming up over the next few months. And so take a look at those upcoming topics, tell a friend, invite some more people. It's going to be a good time. I can't guarantee you that we're going to have better songs than the one that we heard today, but it's going to be good. And so I encourage you to continue to attend these events, and we'll make them better and better every time. So thank you again for your attendance today.